The rain poured mercilessly against the grand estate, drumming against the windows of the millionaire's mansion. Inside, Alexander Pierce stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand, lost in thought, until the frantic shouting of his groundskeeper shattered the silence. "Sir, you need to see this!" Alexander turned, frowning. His staff knew better than to disturb him unless it was urgent. He set down his glass and followed the man outside, where the rain had turned the garden into a muddy mess, and there, beneath the glowing lantern light, lay a small figure, frail, soaked to the bone, and barely breathing. A little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7, her tiny frame curled up like a discarded rag doll. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt, and her lips were pale from the cold. But it wasn't just the state she was in that sent a strange unease through Alexander. It was the sight of her fingers tightly clenched around a crumpled photograph. Without thinking, he scooped her up, her body worryingly light in his arms. "Get the doctor," he ordered, his voice sharper than usual. As he carried her inside, something tugged at him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have in years. Something about this girl wasn't right. Something about her being here, in his garden, on this night. And when the doctor pried open her tiny hand to retrieve the soaked photograph, Alexander's entire world tilted, because staring back at him was a picture of himself. Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him as he stared at the photograph. It was old, slightly torn at the edges, but there was no mistaking it. It was him. His own face, captured in a picture he didn't even remember taking. His pulse thundered in his ears as the doctor worked quickly, checking the girl's breathing, placing a warm towel over her frail body. "She's malnourished," the doctor muttered. "Probably hasn't eaten properly in weeks." But Alexander barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the girl's pale, dirt-streaked face, his mind racing with 100 unanswered questions. Who was she? Why was she here? And why, out of all the places in this world, was she clutching a photograph of him? The doctor sighed, placing his stethoscope back into his bag. "She needs rest and food, a lot of it." He glanced up at Alexander. "Should I call the authorities?" Alexander hesitated. His instincts screamed yes. This wasn't his problem. He was a businessman, not a caretaker. But something about the way the girl had been lying there in his garden, something about the desperation in the way she had clung to his picture. "No," he said finally. "Not yet?" The doctor raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. He packed up his things and left, while the housekeeper carefully wiped the mud from the girl's fragile skin. And Alexander? He sat in the chair across from the bed, hands clasped together, staring at the child like she was a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. Then, suddenly, so suddenly that it made his heart jolt, the girl stirred. A soft whimper, a flutter of eyelashes. Then finally, those big, frightened eyes opened and locked onto his. For a moment, she just stared. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she said the last thing Alexander ever expected to hear. "You're my father, aren't you?" Alexander felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. His fingers tightened against the arms of his chair, his entire body frozen as the little girl's fragile voice echoed in the silent room. "You're my father, aren't you?" The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. Yet, there she was, small, trembling, staring at him with a desperate kind of hope that made something in his chest ache. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "What did you say?" The girl blinked, her lips parting like she wasn't sure if she had spoken out loud. She hesitated, then clutched the blanket around her thin shoulders. "My mama, she told me before she..." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, swallowing hard. "She said if I ever found you, I'd be safe." Alexander's mind raced. His life had been meticulously planned, every step calculated. There was no room for uncertainty, no loose ends, and certainly no unknown children. "You're mistaken," he said firmly. But even as the words left his mouth, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. "I don't have a daughter." The girl flinched slightly, gripping the blanket tighter. But then, to his surprise, she sat up a little straighter, her small hands trembling but determined. "You don't remember my mama?" she asked, almost accusingly. Alexander exhaled sharply. I don't even know who your mother is. The girl's lips pressed together. She reached under the blanket, fumbling for something. A small, crumpled piece of paper appeared in her hands. She hesitated, then held it out to him. Alexander took it, unfolding it with careful fingers. The moment he saw what was inside, his heart nearly stopped. A name he hadn't thought about in years, a name from a past he had long buried. And beneath that name, a letter. Alexander, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it means she had nowhere else to go but to you. His breath caught. She is yours, Alexander. Please. Don't turn her away. The paper shook slightly in his grip. His hands never shook. But they were now. He looked up at the girl, his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Pierce, the man who had built an empire from nothing, had no idea what to do next. Alexander had faced ruthless businessmen, impossible deals, and betrayals that would have broken lesser men, but nothing had ever made him feel as lost as he did right now, staring at the little girl who claimed to be his daughter. His hands clenched around the letter, the words burning into his mind. She is yours, Alexander. Please don't turn her away. Memories he had locked away for years began to resurface, unwanted and sharp. A woman's laugh, soft brown eyes, a promise he never meant to break. Sophia. The girl, his supposed daughter, watched him carefully, her fingers twisting into the blanket like she was bracing for rejection. What's your name? Alexander finally asked, his voice quieter than before. The girl swallowed. Lena. Lena. He tried to breathe, but the air felt too thick. This was impossible. It had been more than 8 years since he had last seen Sophia, since their short, intense relationship ended in a way neither of them had wanted. She had disappeared, no calls, no letters. He had convinced himself she had moved on. And now, all these years later, here was a little girl with her eyes and his last name, on a letter written by a woman he once... No, he didn't let himself think that way. This doesn't make sense, he muttered, rubbing his temple. Why didn't she tell me? Lena flinched. She wanted to. Her voice was small, but there was something fierce behind it. She waited for you to come back, but you never did. The words hit him harder than they should have. He let out a slow breath, trying to gather his thoughts. Where have you been? How did you end up in my garden? Lena hesitated, then dropped her gaze to her lap. Mama got sick. She clutched the fabric of her oversized sweater. We lost our home. She told me you would help, but she... Her voice broke slightly. She didn't make it? Alexander closed his eyes for a brief second, an unfamiliar weight settling in his chest. Sophia was gone, and Lena had come to him with nothing but hope and a crumpled photograph. He should have called his lawyers, should have demanded a DNA test before letting any of this sink in. But deep down, he already knew the truth. He saw it in her face. She was his, but he wasn't a father. He didn't know how to be. Lena shifted uncomfortably. I can leave, she whispered. I didn't mean to cause problems, She swallowed hard. I didn't know where else to go. Alexander exhaled sharply, staring at the fragile little girl in front of him. She was expecting him to push her away, but instead he did something he never thought he would. He reached forward, gently covering her cold hand with his own. You're not going anywhere, Lena. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. You said your mother told you to find me, right? His voice was steadier now. Then that means you belong here. Lena stared at him like she was trying to decide if he was lying. Finally, after what felt like forever, she nodded. Just once. And for the first time, Alexander realized his life would never be the same again.